I am Krono, developer relations at Cartridge, and I have the good fortune to be sitting down with Glihm, software engineer also at Cartridge, to talk about some really exciting changes that we've been making to Dojo with the upcoming version 1.7. The big change that we're making is the migration from using compiler built-in plugins to implement Dojo functionality to using procedural macros. This might seem like a very inside baseball or low-level change, but it actually has really big implications for how Dojo works, how Dojo performs, and how easy it is for you, the developer, to build with Dojo. So, Glenn, what were some of the challenges of working with the compiler built-in plugins?
So in the time we used it, a built-in plugin at the beginning was only in compile time. You had to inject your code into the compiler, like bind your code to the compiler code. And then Scarp team tried also to have this remote loading of a built-in compiler. I didn't remember all the specifics, but in the case of Dojo, it wasn't something that was working. So one of the challenges that we had is we needed a Scarp fork at this moment where we actually injected our plugin compiler, built-in plugin compiler into this Scarp fork. And then Sozo was using this fork of Scarp. So one of the challenge here is every time Caro version and Scarp version were changing, we had to update our fork with our modifications to make sure it still worked. And at this moment, we try also to supercharge Scarp with some functionalities we needed. But this was a huge effort. Every time a breaking change were released, it was super, not complicated, but it was a lot of work for us to actually keep all those changing is up to date. And for instance, when a new Scarp and Carolang versions were released, we had to make a bunch of effort there to actually bump the versions.
So it sounds like you really had to, the Dojo and the Cartridge team had to maintain a whole Scarp fork on top of all the other development that we were doing. So it's just like another very complicated project just to do for no real benefit.
Yeah, and exactly. And one of the points here also is Scarp team is doing the same thing and they work closely with Starkware. In our case, we are also working closely with those two teams. But the difference here is we are not compiler expert in our end. We have a bunch of other things to maintain. And also every time we had an issue, it was also very time consuming for both, for all the teams, because they had to go into a setup, which is not the canonical setup. And they had to reproduce and just making sure we don't have any other modification somewhere that might impact something they are doing. So it was quite challenging at this time. And also for support, it wasn't that easy because we needed to extract some minimal reproducible examples just to make sure they can work with. So yeah, it was something heavy. Yeah.
That's wild. And I think the fact that you all did that for so long is, I think, really impressive.
But yeah, it was sometimes tough. Some upgrades were tougher than others, but in general, it was a good experience, but heavy task to do.
Yeah, so tell me more. So now we're moving on to procedural macros or proc macros. Tell me more about why that's a better approach for handling these issues and solving these problems.
So procedural macros are very similar to what Rust proposes, right? So just to recap, the concept here is you have your compiler. I will talk about Scarp and compiler, like they are not the same thing, but they are working very closely together. So when I use compiler, Scarp, it might be interchangeable terms. So when you actually want to introduce this meta programming thing now with the proc macros, you have this very easy way to say, okay, I can define in Rust a logic that takes code as input and outputs code, right? And this logic that I write in Rust can actually be fetched at runtime by Scarp, compiled by Scarp, and then inject at runtime into the compiler, which means I can write my own proc macro stuff on my end without knowing anything about the compiler things. I just need to know about how I receive the code, the token stream, and how I can manipulate this stream, and then how I have to output thing for the compiler to accept what I generated. So this is what a proc macro is. And in the Caro compiler, we have three kind of proc macros, but just to not go into details, but they're important to know, we can add some attributes on top of different modules. We can have inline macros, which is just generating code at a very specific place into your statements. And then we have the derived macros, which allows to take a type as input and make some extension of this type.
Yeah, so just to give an example, a very common macro that people will use when building with Dojo is the Dojo model. You hash, open brace, Dojo model, close brace. But under the hood, that's a procedural macro, which is creating a fair amount of code. It's creating a structure for storing state. It's creating structure for fetching with a key. It's creating events to emit so that the Tory indexer can index and send it to the client. A lot of stuff is happening under the hood when you create a Dojo model. And all of that is now much more easy to maintain and extend. Is that a fair summary of what's happening?
Yeah, exactly. Procedural macros makes the process very easy of writing metaprogram, like writing code that rewrite code. And you don't have to know too much details about the compiler. So yes, all the code you mentioned about Dojo that is generated is now way more isolated and way easier to actually reuse. The thing that I wanted to mention is, so proc macros now makes it very easy because since the stabilization of the proc macro API, so the proc macro API is you as a developer, what you can use to actually receive the code and process the code and outputs the code, right, into your Rust code that you are doing to do metaprogrammation. And the cool thing about this is now we don't have to maintain a fork anymore or stuff like this, because this is like upstream scarb that is actually supporting this and the kernel compiler.
So basically now you can write the procedural macro completely separately, take the Scarf compiler as it is, and just compile passing in the procedural macro definitions and have it compile all the additional code without needing to integrate the procedural macros way earlier when you recompile the compiler itself. That was a weird sentence, but hopefully that made sense what I was saying.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the easiest thing to understand that is before, if you wanted to compile a Dojo project, you had to use Sozo just because Sozo was a Scarb and Kero compiler, but with the Dojo plugin. Now you can actually use Scarb to build and test a Dojo project. We still use Sozo because Sozo has some, as I mentioned before, like supercharged functionalities, for instance, checking the size of your contracts, displaying all the statistics of your contract sizes and different stuff like this. But under the hood now, we just forward the build and the test thing to Scarb and Kero compiler, which reduces a bunch what we have to maintain as Cartridge.
It also runs a lot faster.
It does, because it means now every time Kero compiler has optimization or Scarb has optimization, we are benefiting this out of the box.
That sounds incredible. For those of you listening who are not software engineers, this is all exactly what you want when you're developing software. You want to be able to leverage other people's work. You want to keep things isolated. You want to minimize complex interactions. So this is really what we want to hear. Tell me a bit about the process of moving from the compiler built-in plugin to procedural macros. I know with Dojo 1.7, this was a pretty big change, but I know it was a lot of work for the engineering team. So tell me a bit about what it was like to make that change.
So we are two engineers, I would say, working on that, and myself, but Remy did a bunch of work there. So the work that we had to do is the following. When we use the built-in plugins, the inputs you have for your plugin to manipulate the code was different from the inputs the proc macro provides you to work with the code. So you have to see that like the old logic had to use some, I would say, deeper types into the Kero compiler. So we had to know a bit more about how the compiler architects the database of the different items it is parsing and how it represents the code it is parsing. And the other end, the new logic is using a more lightweight thing, which is this token stream we receive, and then we just process this token stream. So we have to have less knowledge about how the compiler exactly works. But the logic itself is similar, right? So what we were doing before, it's still what we are doing.
So the actual implementation of the Dojo model hasn't really changed. A lot of the Rust code, the code generation is the same, but the interface with which our metaprogramming interfaces with the compilation step that was changed and ultimately made much simpler. For those of you familiar with compilers, you'll come across concepts like abstract syntax trees and intermediate low-level representations. It sounds like before you were dealing more with that, and now it's more of just a text stream that you can manipulate and process a lot more simply and cleanly.
Exactly. So we have access to less data, but at some point it's better because it just scopes you to what you can do in this particular position. It's a big change, technically speaking, but if we keep about the logic itself, we are still generating roughly the same code. Yeah.
I think
It's a big
generally
challenge.
blockchain development is difficult enough. So if you can simplify anything, you should probably take the opportunity to do.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think the biggest win here is not even about the logic we write and stuff. It's more about, as you mentioned just before, like being able to leverage others' work, not having to care about, oh, we are doing something that is actually not the canonical way of doing it. So if we have an issue, we might have a bunch of things interacting that are not interacting in a upstream repository. This is a kind of thing that you do want to avoid. And something that is just insane right now is for this process of moving from built-in compiler to proc macros. We had this good relationship with Carp team where Remy, for instance, were seeing some stuff that, oh, maybe if we have a function to do that would be easier. Or maybe if we have this, it will be easier. It was a very good moment because we had this momentum of building and helping them shaping this proc macro API just by making feedback. And as Dojo was one of the like only projects using the built-in plugin compiler, it was great for them at some point because it was a project using everything, the three kinds of macros, and we are generating a bunch of things. If Dojo were working, there is a high chance any other proc macro projects will work. So it was a very good relationship and a really good moment to actually help them with some feedback.
Absolutely. It is great to hear how Dojo has really been pushing and helping the ecosystem forward by just pushing the limit of what the stack can do. I think we talk a lot about how gaming generally is always pushing the frontier of any technology because player demand for performance and experience is usually much higher than other areas of software. I think this is an example of
Yeah.
that really put into practice. I think the last thing I'm curious about, Glihm, tell us a bit about the benefits for Dojo users going forward. I think players, but also I think mostly developers. What are the benefits they're going to see going forward after this big change?
So the first benefit I want to mention is we are now ecosystem standard, which means every time a tool is being released, every time there is a bump in Caro version or Scarp versions, every time there are optimizations in the compiler and everything, we just benefit them. And one example is the language server. We never had it working before because with built-in plugin, it was a huge work for compiler team and then Scarp team to actually support all of this. They did some attempts to simplify, but with Dojo, we never had this fully working.
Yeah.
And now this is the kind of thing you have out of the box, right? So if tomorrow someone decides to do something in the Caro ecosystem, Dojo developers will now benefit this out of the box without having to making sure Dojo is compatible,
Gotcha.
which is, in my opinion, the biggest benefit
That makes sense.
right now.
And for those unfamiliar, the language server is basically a tool that your code editor will use to help understand the code that you're writing. So if you ever see in the red squiggles under some definition, that's because the language server is not able to supply the right context to your editor. Now you'll be able to have a more useful syntax highlighting, code lookups, and so forth. Is that kind of a fair summary?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, exactly. So this is the biggest benefit, and other benefits will be we will have a quicker support for new Caro versions, Scarp upgrades, and all of this. And one other benefit is when you use in software, when you want to write code, you usually depend on third-party dependencies, right? Because as we mentioned before, someone may already have written some code you want to reuse. And one big blocker right now, which is still true, and we are working to remove this one, is when you want to use a Dojo version, you have to use a very specific revision of Dojo, right? Because when you use these software management things about dependencies, you can fetch dependencies based on the version rules, right? So you can say, oh, I want to use the version 2 of this program. Oh, I want to use the version 1 of this program and stuff like this. So right now, when you use Dojo, you have to give a very specific revision. But once we will be able to publish Dojo as a regular package into Scarp, then it will be way easier for people to deal with different versions. When we have Dojo upgrades, it will be easier for them to actually manage these upgrades.
It's amazing. When I talk to people in the ecosystem, something we hear a lot or have heard lately is managing upgrades can be very challenging for all the studios because things are changing so fast, things are so bleeding edge that some teams spend arguably too much time having to manage upgrades. And so being able to make those upgrade processes simpler, ensuring that there's just a wider range of interoperability among different versions is a huge win for the ecosystem and for all the Dojo developers. Do you have any more thoughts or things you want to share or things you feel like we didn't get to talk about the Dojo 1.7 upgrade to procedural macros?
Mentioned at the beginning, I do think that the 1.7 upgrade will be one of the major release of Dojo, and I really encourage everybody to jump into this release once they can. We have some things prepared for people that already have some deployed contracts on public networks like mainnets, just for the migration to happen correctly. But yeah, if you are diving into Dojo, we definitely recommend you to use 1.7 once it's out. And yeah, it has been incredible to build those things and keep building this. One of the biggest things we can thank in the ecosystem is the patience of the different studio building right now. Even for us, it's hard to follow the network upgrades, but in their case, they have to also follow Dojo upgrades. They have been very patient and making a ton of feedback, and this is why Dojo today it's evolving in the, I hope, in the good direction.
We would be literally nothing without the studios building on our platform.
100%.
Amazing. Glihm, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great discussion. I think a lot of interesting things that many people in the ecosystem might not have been aware of. And so we're very happy to be able to bring this knowledge to you. Our hope is to produce more conversations like this so that people in the ecosystem can get a better sense of what's going on with Dojo under the hood. It's such an amazing technology stack, and we just are so happy to be able to share it with you.
Thank you very much, Krono, for taking the time, and everybody listening, and wishing you a great day, man.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
All right. Take care, everyone.